What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Babble's Nonsense podcast. I want to first start out by thanking everyone for supporting last week's episode with the people pleasing. I think it's safe to say that majority of us are people pleasers or, surviving people pleasing. So it seems like everyone really enjoyed that episode. So to piggyback off that episode a little bit, I want to dive into vulnerability in this episode, kind of from a different take, because I know I've done this on episodes in the past. So I tend to overshare and tend to be vulnerable maybe when I shouldn't, which is odd because it's hard for me to open up to new people. So I think it's just mostly honestly, it's probably more in my dating life that I tend to overshare and be more vulnerable when I probably should be a little bit more reserved. So I wanted to take it from a different perspective and talk about it like how it's good for us to be vulnerable and how it can also harm us as well. And when I say harm, I don't mean truly harm. I just meant it can maybe either have you end up leaving crying or heartbroken or whatnot when we choose to be vulnerable with, maybe not the right people. So if you're interested in this topic, then stay tuned. All right, guys. Well, like I said in the intro, today we are going to be talking about vulnerability. I'm just going to go ahead and say, just ignore every time I mess up that word because for whatever reason, I'm having difficulty with it. But I also know that this word gets tossed around a lot. Like it's something, oh, it's so cute. It's so empowering. Like the more vulnerable you are, the better. But then you have the flip side of it where people are taught, mostly men, I would say, are told not to be vulnerable because that makes you weak. So I wanted to do a different approach in this episode. I have talked about vulnerability in the past and, how we can try to be more vulnerable, but I also never had thought about being vulnerable where it could maybe harm you or become more negative, and I've never thought about it from that perspective, probably because I tend to be an oversharer, which sometimes makes you vulnerable without even wanting to be or trying to be. You're just trying to, get a point across or have someone listen to you or whatever. But then I was looking this up because I wanted obviously a topic for this week to follow the people pleasing. And then I just realized when I looked it up, there was here's some ways it can be positive and then here's some ways it can be negative. So let's talk about where being vulnerable helps and where it absolutely does not. And again, I'm not a therapist nor am I a life coach. I just get interested in these topics. I don't know. I just really kind of like how the human brain works. And I always want to know why someone is thinking what they're thinking. I typically ask a lot of why questions or become very inquisitive, which can come across as rude to some, which if y'all are my friends, you're probably sitting there nodding your head yes. But honestly, from my perception and what I'm actually trying to do is just to understand how someone came to that conclusion, how someone came to that thought process. And honestly, I don't think it's a bad trait. I used to hate it because I was always like, why? I need to understand. Why can't I be like everybody else and just be like, okay, it is what it is. Well, that's not how my brain is wired. And if you're like that, trust me, it's a blessing and a curse. But let's get into it. So how is vulnerability here to help you? So we're going to talk about the good stuff first, and then we'll talk about how it can harm you later. So number one, it deepens real connections. When you're vulnerable, truly honest about your fears, your flaws, your feelings, you give the right people permission to meet you there. Not the quote unquote, I'm fine, but the real messy human version of you. I'm still bad about saying I'm fine. I feel like I'm a strong, independent person, and I feel like I've had to do a lot of stuff on my own. So when people truly ask me, how are you doing? Or maybe I went through a breakup or, stopped dating someone and someone's like, well, how are you doing? And I'm just like, oh, I'm fine. Just trying not to put my problems on other people because I know other people are going through stuff too. That brings me to another kind of thought. I used to tell people oh, my story doesn't matter. It's, there's people out there who have worse, but actually our stories do matter. And the reason why I say that is because it does tell a person kind of how you got to the thought process that you got to. And obviously I have things in my head that I'm thinking about, like certain conversations that I've had with certain people, and we'll see how this podcast lays out and where I can kind of intermingle personal stories. But going back to like saying I'm fine all the time or whatnot, I think if we could honestly, or just open up and be honest and just say, or be vulnerable and say, yes, I'm hurting right now, or no, I'm not doing so good. And I think it goes back to like that people pleasing mentality that we talked about last week. Like, and just like I just said a few minutes ago, like sometimes we don't want to burden others, or we don't want people to think that we are going through something difficult. Our life is quote unquote perfect. It's Instagram worthy. And so we don't want people to think, oh, she's going through something too. But honestly, I think it makes us humans. I think that's why one of the reasons why I started this podcast is because I think that we all have these thoughts surrounding our brains, not daily like mine, but you have these thoughts and you're like, I wonder if anyone else thinks this too, or am I alone in this thought process? I mean, obviously we have the internet now and we could all get on Reddit or TikTok and find out, but I'm just saying like, that's one of the reasons why I did want to start the podcast. But going back to like the people, just not telling the whole truth of how they're feeling. And then if we could just start telling people how we're feeling, like slowly and little, I think that helps open you up to be more vulnerable in those deeper connections. Like obviously, like if someone comes up to you and I don't know, let's say you work at Walmart and you're a cashier and your customer's like, how are you doing? I don't think spilling your guts to that person is the moment to be vulnerable, but maybe we could try a little bit riskier things and just be like, oh, it's been a tough day, but I'm sure it'll get better, or, anything just to kind of give you those moments of opening up to be a little bit more vulnerable, so that if a friend comes to you and says, how are you doing? You don't just say, I'm fine. You can talk to your friend and be vulnerable. But number 2, being vulnerable can build self-respect. So there is something powerful about speaking your truth, even when it's scary. Vulnerability isn't always about connection with others. Sometimes it's about connection with yourself, about not betraying your own feelings just to appear chill or unbothered, or what's the other phrase? It is what it is. I'm just going with the flow. Because let's be honest, pretending you don't care when you do can become exhausting. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there are people out there that truly don't care and truly can go with the flow. But for the people that can't, and you can't open up and be vulnerable and show like that, like being like, well, I just can't do that, or explaining why you can't do that or why it stresses you out. For example, I have a friend who is one of my best friends who is a chill, go with the flow person. Like she doesn't have to have an itinerary. She doesn't even need to know, like if we're going on a trip, she doesn't even need to know when we're booking a flight. I mean, she will. I'm just, saucing this up for the podcast, but she can do that. But if we start getting like 4 weeks before, oh, we don't have a flight, we don't have a hotel, this is really, really bugging me. We're just very different people. And I think that understanding personalities also helps when it comes to being vulnerable, but also builds that self-respect within your friendship as well. There's also always a way to communicate, right? Like I can't go up to my friend and be like, bitch, can you please figure this out? Like she's going to take offense to that because her personality and her brain isn't wired that way. So I can easily come up to her and just say, hey girl, this is really stressing me out. Can we have a deadline, or can we compromise on when the flight should be booked? Something like that. And vice versa. Like just because my personality is the more aggressive one usually. And when I say aggressive, I mean, like it's more because I'm so loud, I'm so vocal most of the time. It can be perceived as the negative of the two, where I do think people who are quieter or who don't speak up or, are chill and go with the flow, I think that sometimes we have to remember they're compromising is both ways, right? But anyways, enough about that. Number 3 on how vulnerability can be positive. It exposes who's not for you. So this one can sting a little bit, but it also can be a gift. So when you're vulnerable with someone and they shut down, ghost, or mock you, that is information. And we have to remember that. It's painful, or it can be painful, but it also can clarify, because a lot of, I'm learning no answer is an answer. And that was really hard for me for a really long time. I think I mentioned this on a past podcast where I talked about how being ignored is just really hard for me because of my childhood trauma. And so I'm having to work through that. And the more I work through that, the more I realize, like, okay, if someone doesn't answer you or doesn't answer you in the way that you expected or wanted, that is an answer, So stop asking why, talking to myself, to find a different answer, because that's what you're trying to do, is you're just trying to find a different answer. But anyways, vulnerability has a way of revealing what's real and what's performative. And even though it hurts, you just saved yourself months or years of guessing when someone says no. And that's something I had to tell myself. So those are the 3 of the positives for vulnerability. And then here are some of the ways, I think it's 3 ways vulnerability can hurt you. So we're going to talk about that side for now, because being vulnerable is not always being brave or beautiful in that moment that we want it to be. So number 1 on how vulnerability can seem on the more negative side or hurtful side is when the other person hasn't earned it. And what that means is, like, we have to realize that not everyone deserves access to our hearts. I'm really bad about that. I know some people who meet me, like, in my professional life think I am pretty closed off, but I really do have a huge heart, and I get hurt a lot because I try to make myself come across like I don't care when I really care a lot. Yeah, that's vulnerable right there to say that, because sometimes, like, it's a self-defense mechanism, right? And then sometimes we confuse oversharing with connection. So, I overshare a lot to a lot of people, aka this podcast. And sometimes, when I meet someone that's willing to listen or willing to communicate back, sometimes I do confuse that with having a connection with them, because it's hard to find those people who will overshare back or communicate back. So just remember that vulnerability without the boundaries is just emotional exposure. So you're just kind of putting yourself out there for people to hurt you. And I'm not saying intentionally hurt you, but for example, like when I was dating, and I tend to overshare because I'm very nervous, I have social anxiety, and I just kind of talk a lot, especially on the first date. And if someone asks me a question, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll tell you all about that. I'll tell you the truth. Da 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 da. Blah 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 blah. And sometimes if you're being vulnerable with someone and you're doing it because they're a good listener or whatever, and you think that they care, sometimes they may use that to harm you later. Sometimes they just want the playbook to know how to hurt you or to play you or to get away with it. Why? I still haven't figured out, but just remember that that is one way that it can harm you. So if someone hasn't shown the consistency or emotional maturity or that they care about you, probably not the best place to overshare or drop the truths. AKA me. So basically dating. Think about that in the dating world. If you're out dating someone new, sometimes it is good to stay a little mysterious. It's very hard for me. I always say, like, I can't be someone I'm not. And so maybe I'm just going to have to wait for the person who accepts flaws and all. And number 2 for how vulnerability can sometimes harm us is when it becomes a pattern of self-abandonment, which, raise the hand here. So like, have you ever been in a situation where you're always the one reaching out to someone, opening up, saying, hey, can we talk? I really got something to say, because I'll tell you right now, that typically is me. So if you find yourself being vulnerable over and over again with someone who gives you crumbs in return, that's not intimacy nor vulnerability on their behalf. That is a power imbalance. And like Menu is always talking about, we have to keep our power, because when you give it away, it does become very unattractive. And that is something I would say I've done a lot in my dating life. I gave them all the power. Oh, what if they don't like me? Or what if they don't like when I say this? Or, anything like that. And that is unattractive, because so what if they don't like what I have to say? They don't have to like what I have to say. They don't have to agree with what I have to say. But what they do have to do, if we're in this partnership together, is be willing to listen. And if they're not willing to listen or not willing to be vulnerable back, then that's really not a partnership. That is just a power imbalance. So sometimes being quote unquote vulnerable is just a way we keep chasing validation from someone who's not capable of giving it. So just remember that. I really should have probably had Me and You on this episode to go over it, because she would have a lot more life coaching things to say versus me. I can just give you kind of examples. But the third way that being vulnerable can sometimes harm us is when you use it to control the outcome. So sometimes this is subtle, but it can be very real. Like, for example, we can think, if I just say this vulnerable thing, they'll see how much I care, they'll change, they'll listen, or whatever else you want to put in there. And then when the person doesn't change or doesn't listen or doesn't care, we are heartbroken. We're left heartbroken. We're left in the dust, because when you're not being authentically vulnerable to express how you're feeling, that can then turn into a manipulation tactic where you're just trying to be vulnerable to convince someone to agree with you. I have seen that happen. I've never done that actually. Like when I'm being vulnerable, I'm truly being vulnerable to express how I'm feeling. And sometimes it comes across way wrong because I need to sometimes learn to take a step away and come back to the situation when I can better explain it or better articulate it. But anyways, I think here's some of the truths that I've had to come to realize in a lot of situations that have been going on in my life lately, is that vulnerability can be a tool. It's not a personality trait. I don't think everyone's walking around going, I'm a vulnerable person. I think we all want that, but it can be a tool where if you can tap into that emotion and you can open up and you can be vulnerable, then I think that does bring out like a more sensitive side and a more attractive side of you, because if you can open that up, it just, I don't know how to explain it, but it just comes across more authentic. But we also have to know that we don't owe that to everyone, something that I'm learning myself. But we have to start using discernment on who gets our vulnerable side, who we can be emotionally safe with, who we know is going to empower us, and who we know is going to encourage us to continue that side. And I think when you have two people that are willing to be vulnerable, whether it be new or not, I think that does become a power, because you can learn each other better and you can grow better. But when you have someone who is willing to be vulnerable and someone who is willing to not be vulnerable, then that's where the mishaps happen, the miscommunications happen, because you have to also be like, for example, if I'm being vulnerable to someone and they're not listening or they're not hearing me and they're not willing to be vulnerable back, then a conversation usually shuts down. And if they are willing to be vulnerable back, then I also think as women, and sorry, this is one thing I am going to say about women, I think as women, it's already hard enough for men to be vulnerable because of society and the way they were raised and things like that. I think it's getting better the more women are trying to teach men their emotions. But I think that if a man is and willing, after, harping on it for a long time, to be vulnerable back, I think that's when women have to sit quiet and listen and truly listen to hear what they're saying. Otherwise, it shuts it down. If we immediately interrupt or we immediately say, no, or we do any of that, that's discounting someone else's feelings. But also you have to have the emotional intelligence to know if they are doing what, like we said earlier, if they are, being vulnerable to convince or, manipulate, or they're actually truly being vulnerable. And I think if you have the discernment, and you should be able to tell that. But obviously I'm not a therapist. I can't tell you how to tell that. But I think that's something we as women need to get better at. We need to get better at listening to men when they're being vulnerable and not just automatically shutting it down. Because when you shut it down, then forget it. And then don't get mad when they're not vulnerable again. You know what I'm saying? But just know that the whole caveat to this podcast is vulnerability with the right people will deepen your connection, and vulnerability with the wrong people can deepen your wounds, and you will remain heartbroken. So the goal isn't to never not be vulnerable. The goal is to be wise about when and with who we are vulnerable with. So if you're struggling with being vulnerable, just know that you're not alone. It takes guts. It's not for the faint of heart. And I would say I get real vulnerable with people very easily, and I probably shouldn't. But then I also have a very hard time of letting people in my circle. So that's also needs to go into life coaching. Sometimes when I do these podcasts, I'm like, okay, now I know what I need to talk about in therapy next. But I'll tell you this. Vulnerability done right can and will filter your life. It will show you who's real. It will bring you the right people closer, and it will help you stop dimming your light just to make someone else feel more comfortable. And if someone can't handle your honesty, your tenderness, or your truth, then that says more about them and not anything about you or your worth. So that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for listening. And as always, guys, until next time, bye.